I'm Soumaya Balbolia, Medical Director of Biosency, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar session. Today I have the pleasure to have with me Dr. Jean-Claude Cornu, pulmonologist and head of the pneumology department at Verdun Hospital. Good morning, Dr. Cornu.
Hello, Soumaya. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present this clinical case. I'm very flattered. Now, I'll explain it to you in a few moments.
I can see that you are supported by your team.
I'm surrounded by the EMUS team. That is the team in charge of remote monitoring and surveillance of patients enrolled in the EMUS COPD study, which is drawing to a close and on which we've been working for 2.5 years. So I've got the secretary, who's one of the pillars of the study, and on my right is a nurse from the pool of nurses who do the telemonitoring, and a young student nurse next to her.
Thank you for coming, and we're delighted to welcome you all for this webinar, which is dedicated to a step forward in patient management with COPD. Thanks in particular to telemonitoring. So how I'm going to share my screen and how this webinar will be organized. First of all, we're going to look at some background information on the disease, on COPD, the importance of early detection of exacerbations, particularly in terms of public health. And then we'll give a brief presentation, a short presentation of our predictive medicine solution, Bora KR, developed by Biosency. We will introduce the BVS Cube score for early detection of exacerbations. In the second part of the webinar, to Dr. Cornu, who will present a clinical case which will detail the history of a disease, the history of a patient who is being treated at the Verdun Hospital, and in particular the impact of remote monitoring with the Bora band or wristband, including disease management and benefits for the patient and the implications for COPD management. And then after the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So we encourage you to ask your questions, share your experiences if you have any, and then we'll do our best to answer them during the second part of this webinar. So we hope this webinar will provide you with perspectives, practical solutions to improve the management of your COPD patients, thanks to remote medical monitoring. So COPD is obviously a chronic and disabling pathology, which today is a major priority in terms of public health. Here are a few figures to illustrate the scale of this pathology. Why is it so important? Because today it is considered to be a growing epidemic. It is estimated that the number of patients would around 480 million around the world, and today there are projections that which brings us to figures of around 600 million in 2050. So in France, the estimated prevalence is around 3.5 million COPD patients. COPD is the third leading cause of death worldwide, with over 3 million deaths every year. In fact, it is one of the leading causes of death worldwide. That in France, public health figures are around of 17,000 deaths in France every year. This is an alarming figure and shows the impact of this disease in our country. The impact of the disease is obviously an astronomical cost for the healthcare system, a burden for the patient, a burden for caregivers, and a burden on hospitals and doctors. So COPD also leads to frequent hospitalizations. Mortality is high, with 26% of patients dying within 12 months of their first exacerbation and 65% dying within 5 years. These statistics and figures highlight the urgent need to improve detection and management of COPD exacerbations. We'll be talking about it in this webinar, and we obviously have a solution. one of the solutions that could be available to COPD patients, the Bora Carer solution, which today offers an innovative response to this challenge by making it possible to detect early signs, the beginnings and precursors of exacerbations. And we're now able to do this with an average of 3 days before an exacerbation occurs and before it appears. This obviously offers a valuable window of opportunity for early intervention of COPD exacerbations. This is a brief presentation of the Bora Carer solution, which has been developed by Biosency. It's an innovative predictive medicine solution. Biosency is a company that was founded in 2017. And our major mission is to secure the patient pathway and the care of COPD patients at home, thanks to advanced predictive medicine technologies. Our solution is made up of complementary modules. First, we have a connected wristband, the Bora Band ER wristband, which has been on the market since 2020. After obtaining CE marking, of course, it's a Class 2A medical device. The Bora Band or wristband measures the patient's vital signs. Vital signs are heart rate, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, and blood pressure. Oxygen saturation and patient activity in terms of number of steps and hours. The Bora Flow module completes this solution. Bora Flow is a platform for collecting data from non-invasive ventilation machines. So it's a platform that's currently registered as a digital medical device and complies with ANS and has requirements for remote medical monitoring of chronic respiratory failure. The platform has been in production since last February. Data from the Bora Band or wristband and the Bora Flow platform are centralized on a single platform, the Bora Connector platform, which is a collaborative interoperable platform, which offers a comprehensive, complementary, and integrated view of data from the Bora Band or wristband and data from non-invasive ventilation. So, our solution is obviously distinguished by another product, namely its ability to detect early precursors of COPD exacerbations, and I'll come back to this in the following slides, with our BVS Cube COPD exacerbation prediction score, which today offers fairly respectable diagnostic performance. And now I come to this early exacerbation detection score, the BVS Cube. BVS Cube stands for Bora Vital Signs. Standard score. Today, this score provides a detailed, customized assessment of the evolution of respiratory status. The score is calculated in real time and every hour from data collected with the Bora Band or bracelet, and continuously monitor the 3 vital parameters of heart rate, respiratory rate, and oxygen saturation. So let's take a quick look at how this predictive score works. How does this score work? The BVS Cube algorithm starts by establishing a baseline by monitoring the patient's vital signs over a minimum period of 3 days. This then defines, in quotation marks, values that are normal for the patient. Ultimately, it's an automatic learning process based on a continuous flow of data, which enables us to build up this baseline zone or baseline phase. A second phase then follows. It's continuous monitoring, where the wristband collects data continuously in real time and will be able to compare all the data observed on this line over this period, compared to the base phase, the baseline. In other words, the score will ultimately reflect deviations from the average established during this first baseline phase. So how is detection carried out? When, for example, this blue score here means that there is absolutely no risk of an exacerbation in the coming days. When the score exceeds a certain threshold. So if there's a fairly significant deviation from the baseline, this indicates a significant divergence in vital signs, which will ultimately signal a period of risk of exacerbation. So what we could say about this exacerbation score is that today it could be fully considered as a digital biomarker because it meets the various criteria of a marker. That is its objective. We recover the quantitative data. We can quantify it, and it will transpose fairly accurately the improvement or deterioration of physiological signs. The question is how we came up with this score and what are the scientific bases of a diagnostic score for exacerbations. In fact, the benefits of our solution are obviously based on clinical evidences, and in particular the EMUSE study mentioned by Dr. Cornu at the beginning of his speech has been invaluable in establishing this score for predicting COPD exacerbations. For the simple reason that we've been integrated into this wonderful project called EMUSE with the Biosency solution for remote patient monitoring, a cohort of COPD patients. These are the first results established on patients, which now enable us to work on the possibility of detecting exacerbations. These are results we presented to the ATS conference last year, which allow us to say that we can detect these premises early in 4 to 6% of cases in patients 3 days before exacerbations occur. So that's what we define as sensitivity, and with a specificity rate of 9%, that means we have a fairly low false negative and false positive rate. So today we're working on patients. Now we've come to the end of the inclusions, haven't we, Dr. Cornu, in the EMU study? We're going to consolidate our data, our results, and our diagnostic performance on the 200 patients, and we hope to have a publication by the end of this year. So I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Cornu, who's going to give us a case study. Score and platform, a Bora connector at Verdun Hospital. Dr. Cornu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to explain and present this clinical case, which illustrates perfectly the benefits of remote monitoring and the BVS cube score in particular. It's just one case among many, since we've seen many identical cases, and in many circumstances we've been able to take action, as you'll see here. I'd like to present the case of a 52-year-old patient, active smoker, not obese, a smoker who started smoking at a very early age and already had a number of comorbidities, including hypertension, coronary artery disease, and a history of depression. She is an extremely anxious patient, following a number of family problems. A very special context. And I'd seen her for the first time in October 2023 as part of a workup for exertional dyspnea. Well, the workup revealed COPD and emphysema essentially, with an obstructive RFE syndrome indicating stage 1 COPD, which is moderate in itself, but accompanied by significant emphysema with diffusion. Diffusion of gases is reduced to 44%, with significant distension. Residual volume increased by more than 100%. Scanner confirmed distension. Scanner confirmed emphysema. All this was accompanied by fairly marked resting hypoxia, with an oxygen partial pressure of 61 without hypercapnia and a normal carbon dioxide partial pressure. She was put on background treatment with Trimbo-Nextaler with Ventolin as rescue therapy. Here is the patient's presentation. Let's move on. She was included in the EMUSE COPD study last February. She's one of the latest patients we've taken on as part of this study, which combines monitoring of COPD and OSA patients. In all, 400 patients were included. Inclusion ended last February, March. We started remote monitoring. Everything went well for a while. Then at the end of May, the criteria that we systematically look for, that the nurse behind me systematically looks for on a daily basis, appeared. Desaturation accompanied by a BVS cube alert. This desaturation was accompanied, you'll see the curves in a moment, they're really magnificent and quite typical. An increase in heart rate and an increase in respiratory rate. The problem is that all this happened over a weekend. The EMU's team simply started treatment the following Monday. The nurse called the patient, who said, "I'm feeling a bit short of breath and I had a bit of a fever at the weekend." But if we hadn't called her, I don't think she would have been worried at the time. The EMU's nurse brought this case to my attention. Given the truly typical appearance of the variations and the BVS cube, I decided to consider it an exacerbation at that point. An appropriate treatment was started, combining corticosteroid antibiotics and bronchodilator sprays. We monitored her daily, calling every day, just to monitor progress. A few days later, the nurse told me that she wasn't any better, that she still had a fever. Since she has, like almost all COPD patients, a saturometer, she was noticing desaturations. And with a very anxious background like she has, I decided to see her in consultation as a matter of urgency, to take stock, to see her face, to find out a little bit about how she was doing. Blood gases were taken that day, confirming a deterioration, with partial oxygen pressure at 55 and hypocapnia at 32 millimeters of mercury, which I found a little surprising. Oxygen therapy was started. The biological tests I had taken ruled out pulmonary embolism with a good probability, with D-dimer levels within the normal range, but with an inflammatory syndrome suggesting an underlying infectious process. So I was a little worried because she was supposed to have been on treatment for 3 days. But in fact, for different reasons, solitude, difficulties in getting around, she had only been on her treatment for a dozen hours, which explained the lack of efficacy of the treatment started at the time of the alert. The evolution was subsequently favorable. I did, however, have an angioscanner done, but mainly to check whether there wasn't also a focus of pneumopathy, and then I'm more of a careful kind of guy, so I thought, okay, but she still has hypocapnia, she's desaturated, I don't really understand why. The angioscanner also ruled out pulmonary embolism. No infectious focus was found, and then the evolution was slowly favorable. With hypoxia a little more marked than at the initial assessment, but which gradually settled down, and still hypercapnia, which also settled later on. I saw him for the last time on June 21st, with a patient who had regained her spirits, who was feeling much better, who had been weaned off oxygen, who was able to gambol around again to the best of her ability. So much for progress. I think that we slowed down and avoided hospitalization thanks to this remote monitoring. We can now move on to the curves to visualize the elements that alarmed us. So you can see on the first line the BVS cube, the day on which the BVS cube alert occurred, May 24th. And you can see that this alert on the underlying curves, in particular saturation, corresponds to a gradual desaturation that reaches 82% on May 28th, and that she will then gradually normalize. Initially, somewhat artificially, as she was placed on oxygen, it will normalize and return to the patient's previous values, namely saturations of around 90 and 92%. At the same time, you can see this increase in respiratory rate on the respiratory frequency curve. And then if you go down a little further, you'll see the heart rate, which also accelerates. You can see that these three curves evolve in parallel. It's really spectacular, and it's something I think the nurses behind me will confirm. The nurses behind me will confirm. It's something that alerts us every time and makes us think that the patient is covering an exacerbation, presenting an exacerbation, knowing that these anomalies, often we notice them before the patient becomes concerned. There's a bit of a delay on the part of patients. They'll wait until they feel really ill to consult us or call us, whereas we can react very quickly to these anomalies. And we see what happens next. On the weeks that follow, I think there's another slide on follow-up. Soumaya, yes. We can see that there has been no BVS cube alert. Perhaps on July 7th, around the month of July, there was a small spike in BVS cube, but it did not reach the positivity threshold. What we see in all the patients we monitor, namely all COPD patients, is that there are highs, there are lows, there are sometimes small occasional drops in saturation, which corresponds to what patients say when we see them in consultation. There are days when it's better than others, but you can see that it's a one-off isolated event. Around the 2nd of July, when you have a saturation of 87%, it's not accompanied by a clear increase in respiratory frequency. I think these are occasional anomalies that are part of these patients' daily lives. In fact, it's a reflection of these patients' daily lives, because we have these little variations that correspond to what the patients say. And then we also have, this is not the aim today with regard to exacerbations, but we also see their physical activity. We see what they do. We have a little reflection, a little window on their daily lives. And then in the future, also with the use of NIV, maybe also oxygen, we'll see later. So much for this clinical case. No, I think we can move on. Last consultation on June 21st, the patient is doing better. To sum up, we have a stage 1 COPD patient, but emphysematous, in fact, she is more handicapped by her emphysema, still a smoker, unfortunately, with comorbidities. I forgot to tell you that she was also on CPAP for an OSA, who therefore benefited from early detection of this exacerbation. I'm convinced, in fact, I'm sure that this early detection prevented hospitalization. In the case of an unattended patient of this type, as I'm sure you've all experienced, there are two possible scenarios. Firstly, the patient is worried, which would have been the case given her psychological background, and goes straight to the emergency department, which means she ends up in my department in the days that follow and is hospitalized. The second possibility is for her to call her GP, who will probably call her several days later, which will also limit the effectiveness of the treatment and leave room for the exacerbation to worsen in the meantime. If he doesn't simply tell her to go to the emergency room, given the overload of work that our GP colleagues have to deal with, and we have to take into account the fact that we live in a region with a significant debt in general medicine, a responsiveness to patients that can't be perfect, she we feel very isolated in a department like the Muse. So this type of monitoring is a great help here too. In this case, it enabled us to detect an exacerbation, but it also sometimes enables us to tell patients that they're doing well, which can also avoid unnecessary consultations. The fact that these patients are monitored by the Bora band ER also has another advantage. It makes them feel safe. So of course you have to make them understand and also make it clear to doctors that this is not resuscitation monitoring. We're dealing with daily monitoring, but it's not instantaneous. But nevertheless, patients feel reassured. And I think this has a beneficial impact on their quality of life. And this ability to detect exacerbations early also avoids the need for hospitalization. The other benefit of the Bora band ER, which is a little removed from the prevention of exacerbations, is the feedback patients get on their activity. Some patients realize that their physical activity is extremely moderate, and this can encourage them to walk a little more, often, to be a little more active. That's the gist of what I wanted to tell you about this clinical case, and then about the usefulness of this monitoring by the Bora band or wristband in the context of this software, Bora connector, which is a great help for us.
Thank you, Dr. Cornu. You're right to mention that physical activity is important, and it's also an indicator of improvement and clinical benefit from health interventions. If we see patients starting to move, then there's a clinical benefit, and it's a good indicator, particularly for COPD patients, the patients to whom we recommend physical activity, which is always adapted to their condition. So it's a good indicator of benefit. And you're also right to point out that remote medical monitoring is not an emergency device, and it is the legal texts which establish a framework for the practice of remote monitoring. It is not an emergency device, and we must always remember that when the patient is not feeling well, the first thing to do is not wait for the doctor monitoring them to contact them, but to make a single gesture, approach the emergency services, and that's the reflex every patient should have when they're feeling unwell. And then the medical question, yes?
So I'm reading effective communication, and to come back to that, we're lucky to use this remote monitoring as part of a study with a whole team, which makes it easier for us. The lesson to be drawn from all this is that you obviously need an intermediary between the technical data, the clinical data, and the technical data provided by the remote monitoring and the doctor. So we're lucky enough to have a whole team behind us to do this work, which limits the doctor's job to managing acute cases, so to speak. So that's obviously a plus, and we mustn't lose that.
Absolutely. Of course, you can also ask your questions in the Questions and Answers tab, so don't hesitate to ask Dr. Cornu and us Biosency any questions you may have. He will be delighted to answer all your questions. But while we're waiting for the questions to come in, Dr. Cornu, you actually talked about the resources you have internally to manage all these alerts. In fact, I'd like to have your feedback on the organization. When we talk about remote monitoring, we're talking about the organizational impact that remote monitoring can have. And there are a lot of questions about organization. How did you manage to make it a success for yourself?
That's what I was saying straight away, that we're lucky enough to have this EMUSE study, which was commissioned by the EMUSE department and concerns the north of the department. We're a very small department, so we're working on half a department. This eMuse study was initially initiated by politicians because the Muse region, as I said earlier, is a department with a shortage of specialists and general practitioners. And the question posed, it was a study, the question posed was whether this type of remote monitoring would improve care. For me, the answer is obvious. I think so. So this eMuse study has enabled us to set up a remote monitoring team with nurses, a group of nurses who take turns on a daily basis to monitor the data on Bora connector. So check for signs of exacerbation. They're nurses from my department, obviously, and consultation nurses, so they're used to monitor these pathologies. And what's more, they know most of the time all the patients, even most of the time, I'll leave out most, who know all the patients included in this study. So they monitor the technical data. They come to see me and we draw up a summary and decide on a course of action for the patient in question, which may be to wait 24 hours, because sometimes the anomalies are a bit borderline, or to call or to see the patient urgently, as with this patient, or to send him a prescription with an emergency treatment, or to advise him to go and see his GP. So that's the team. As it's part of a study, there's obviously a lot of paperwork to fill in, and the team is also made up of a secretary. For 2.5 years, we've been working on this. And it's a rewarding job because it's an important responsibility for the nurses. I think it's very rewarding for nurses. It's really something that has helped the whole team to progress.
It creates a different relationship with the patient.
Miss Peggy, go ahead.
There's also a different approach, and as a result, bonds are formed over time. There's a trust that develops, and they don't hesitate to call us, or we don't hesitate to talk to them for a while on the phone to reassure them, even if the case is not worrying.
Of course, we're lucky enough to have all this funded as part of a study. But that, of course, is a blessing not shared by everyone, unfortunately. And so theoretically, if all goes well, next year the study will be extended to include 1,100 more patients, so there's apnea and COPD, with an extension to Meurthe-et-Moselle.
So we have a first question, which says, what is your opinion on COPD follow-up of severe patients on oxygen therapy? What's the point of monitoring severe patients on oxygen therapy? With effort, interest, and problem? That's the question.
The point is obviously to check essentially at night, when the patient is at rest in any case, to check that oxygen flow adaptation is correct. It's really something that's useful to us, particularly for this patient. For example, we can see that as soon as we put her on oxygen, she returns to correct values. With exercise, it's more complicated because, like all these connected bracelets, whether they're classic watches or whatever, when there's movement, you get less data. But I think that with advances in technology, we'll undoubtedly have increasingly reliable data. But already overall, in a patient at rest, we have good information on the adaptation of oxygen flow. And conversely, when we see drops in oxygen flow, well, we can call the patient and ask him to increase his flow or see him in consultation. SpO2 monitoring also has another advantage, which we tested many times during the study, namely the detection of nocturnal saturations. Which in general, when patients are not equipped with a CPAP or are not on oxygen, we perform a screening polygraph, and very often we come across a sleep apnea syndrome that has been overlooked. When we have doubts about the saturation value, we can also make a phone call to the provider at the time and ask him to perform an oximetric or oxycapnographic measurement on the patient at night to check and confirm Bora band or anomalies.
Then I have another question about the BVS cube score and the fact that Mr. Caprandi's question, are there any false positives for the detection of BVS cube? If patients engage in unusual physical activity? So yes, in fact, there's always a risk when tackling any diagnostic tool, a risk of false positives. So for the BVS cube, there could be false positives, of course, but not in the case of unusual activity, for the simple reason that the measurements taken into account are resting measurements. So the device and the technology allow a fairly high level of data feedback when the patient is at rest. When the patient is active, particularly for certain parameters such as oxygen saturation, the quality of the data remains not very good. So as the measurements are taken at rest, there's no risk of false results, of false positives for BVS cube. In addition, infectious signs are placed on medians, which limits the risk of false positives. This means that feedback is obtained when the patient isn't moving around very much.
Which is why it's a good idea to give the patient a call to check if there's a match with clinical signs. In the case we told you about, the patient wasn't worried, but she did tell us that she had a fever. She had a fever, so obviously we have concordant elements.
And yes, that's exactly it. What Dr. Cornu has just touched on is that when we have an alert, what we can possibly do is to consider what the plan of action is when we have an alert. And therein lies the advantage of setting up what we call early management plans, namely when the alert is triggered, when it is objectified on the platform. It's a good idea to call the patient and ask him or her to fill in a symptom questionnaire. So there are patients whose symptoms are highly indicative of an exacerbation or another pathology with the same clinical features. So it's important to bear in mind that telemonitoring is always accompanied by some form of support, whether therapeutic or clinical. Hence the need for remote monitoring units that call the patient and allow us to assess and eliminate these positives. So of course, remote monitoring with alerts is fine, but it's not enough. A whole action plan needs to be put in place. So I have another question for Dr. Cornu, if I may. So we've seen it used for patients undergoing oxygen therapy, but do you see any other uses for remote monitoring? And with what patient profile?
We're about to start a new trial with the Bora flow system in COPD patients on NIV and frequent exacerbators. We're going to include a few patients and monitor them for a month or more to check whether this monitoring will also help prevent exacerbations. Improvement of NIV treatment, all the problems that can arise. So the advantage of Bora flow is that you'll have Bora bandar data and NIV data on the same screen. And I saw another patient today, one of the first to be included in the study. So it's a real comfort to have all these data, both ventilation and clinical. Saturation data and so on the same screen. It's really something that helps to reassure the patient to check. My experience is limited as we're just starting out, but the first case I've just seen this afternoon, which is very fresh, leads me to think that it's going to be something interesting. So here goes. Experimentation. So this is the design of the study with an initial phase, as we explained earlier, of fitting the wristband, which will take a few days for the algorithm to build up and for the BVS cube score to be relevant. Then there'll be the classic monitoring as we do today, with measurements and an action plan to determine how to use the data and alarms we receive.
So that's the management plan we were talking about earlier. The benefits of remote monitoring and the value of calling the patient, as we've just said, and look at symptom questionnaires, in particular an excess score questionnaire, which could be a good one, to be able to eliminate false positives. And then the subsequent management, which could be adapted to suit each patient.
So this is a new direction.
We have another question. What is the technical difference between the device and connected watches or bracelets for precise SpO2 measurement? In my experience, the latter have difficulty with COPD patients. So the first difference is that it's a medical device. There are other devices on the market which obviously for some, as you can imagine, perform well. But they are not medical devices. So the Bora Bander device is a Class 2A medical device. In other words, we've had an initial data validation phase, whether for heart rate or oxygen resaturation. In other words, the idea is to validate a parameter in research laboratories, namely to compare it with a standard goal. SpO2 is typically compared with gasometry. It's a gap that could be closed, and here with our data, we've set up small deviations from the standard goal in the region of 3%. So in fact, the difference lies in the validation of the values. And who will carry out this validation is the notified body that will validate all the claims, particularly for a medical device, which is the case for very few digital solutions. And this is something we've been able to justify ever since Biosency was founded, and from 2020 onwards.
And also that it's only with this type of validated equipment that we can benefit from the remote monitoring quotation.
Yes, absolutely. Here we're in a different category, which is monitoring patients on NIV, and yes, absolutely, in fact, we need to justify different requirements. Here, we're in a parallel situation with NIV, but it's quite true that the ANS and AHS had specifications that are quite extensive, and we were lucky enough to meet all the requirements of the ANS and AHS for our platform. But this is a parallel context, that of remote monitoring of patients with chronic respiratory insufficiency. So there you have it. Do you have any other questions? I don't see any more. No further questions, I'm told. I'd like to ask the teams who are with us, Dr. Cornu, about patient feedback. Earlier, we talked a little about reassuring patients. And in fact, we were told that some patients still want to be monitored. Is this good news? Is it bad news for telemonitoring? There, I see Muriel. You have the floor, Muriel.
Is it you who sees them at the end? Yes.
Yes, I do have many patients who would like to continue monitoring with the Bora Band R because it reassures them. They know we're going to interact quickly. They know there's someone there to listen to them. Yes, very much so.
I think patients say that very frequently. I don't know if it's the standard population, but we're lucky to have very few refusals when we suggest telemonitoring. The biggest failures we've had are mainly due to connection problems. because we still have areas in Meuse with poor telephone and internet coverage, and so connection problems that force us to interrupt monitoring. But on the other hand, patients are generally delighted with monitoring, and so is the doctor.
And so is the doctor. So I have another question. Who can access telemonitoring? According to the law, who has to do the telemonitoring? Is it the nurse?
Is it? I don't know if I'm going to give the right answer. It's a question I've never asked myself because once again, we're lucky enough to be doing all this as part of a study financed by the department and in fact by the Grand Est region. So it's something that doesn't concern us directly, but the day this study comes to an end, the question will arise as to who's doing what. I think there's a new profession of nurse who's going to or it could be another caregiver who's going to interpret and analyze the telemonitoring data and transmit it to the doctors in charge. So I think there's a whole, it's a bit like an ambulance, I think, a 15 center for telemonitoring, perhaps even bringing together different specialties. I think I've understood that cardiologists are well ahead in these structures. I think we need to try and emulate them. We also need to ensure that remote monitoring is not limited to patients on NIV and oxygen, because most of the patients we monitored were neither on NIV nor on oxygen. So in the real world, there was no funding for them. So it's there's a lot of progress to be made in the field of monitoring pneumological patients. And then, once again, we haven't just been monitoring COPD. Pulmonary fibrosis should also be monitored. In short, all patients with more severe pathologies, for example. But all this will require a change in legislation.
So if we bounce back a little on the context of remote monitoring of patients with chronic respiratory insufficiency, Dr. Cornu, in fact, legal texts have clearly defined the profile of prescribers. This is what we call the telemonitoring operator. In the context of respiratory insufficiency, it's either a pulmonologist or a resuscitator who must set up telemonitoring, which is an act covered by the Public Health Code, the Act of Telemonitoring. What's more, it's not just the physician and the resuscitator who are involved in this telemonitoring process. There are all the teams to whom the operator can delegate tasks, particularly alert management tasks, alerts, and this can involve nurses, advanced practice nurses, physiotherapists. If we want to transpose this to the remote monitoring model of NIV and oxygen therapy, it's a model that's completely transposable with its complementary profiles to that of the doctor. And I have another question. This follow-up and this system allow us to identify sleep apnea type problems. Is it possible to diagnose sleep apnea with a device and remote monitoring like that of the Bora Band R and Bora Connect R platform?
Yes, that's what I was saying earlier. When we see certain patients with saturations that are correct during the day, which we know these patients, and then we see that at night there are peaks of desaturation. These are not the peaks we see in sleep apnea, of course, when we do a polygraph, but we can see that nocturnal saturation is not as good. And in this case, we do a polygraphic recording. We suggest a polygraphic recording. The other anomalies we have detected are problems, heart rhythm disorders, with phases of tachycardia, for example, which have led us to refer patients, to advise patients to go and see a cardiologist. We must have detected a few atrial fibrillation like that. So yes, it's good for screening. As we said earlier, the most reliable data are at rest. So by definition, we generally have very good saturation data at night.
Yes, there are nighttime saturations. Absolutely. So I see there are no further questions. I'll leave you a few words to conclude, Dr. Cornu, and then We'll be saying thank you to everyone afterwards.
Well, yes, first of all, thank you for, there were a lot of people there, I think. I don't have the whole list in front of me, but what's that?
We were at 40. I saw 40. That's good.
I'm very pleased. That the muse is highlighted like this. I'm delighted, and I think the whole team too. And so, thank you, Biosency, for giving us this opportunity. Well, the department isn't here, but it's them I thank every time for allowing us to do this study. And I hope that this remote monitoring will develop more and more, including outside this EMUSE study, which we'll soon be able to complete, at least in its first phase. So, thank you all for being here, and then I'll leave you to conclude.
Thank you, Dr. Cornu and the team at the Centre Hospitalier de Verdun for welcoming us here today for this webinar. We hope you found our webinar session useful and inspiring. We'll be sure to keep you informed of future events we'll be putting on with Biosency. In particular, there will probably be an upcoming webinar on the impact of remote monitoring solutions on care pathways, in particular NIV pathways. This is precisely the care pathway presented by Dr. Cornu. A link to the webinar replay will be emailed to you in the next few days. And if you'd like a little more information about Biosency solutions, we're here to help. I'll share an email with you, our contact email. Of course, you can contact us via this contact email, and there's a QR code next to it. To evaluate this webinar session, we're counting on your responses to help us improve for future webinar sessions. So this webinar is now over. Many thanks to the Verdun team, and see you soon for future webinars with Biosency.